The air in Redford that afternoon had that peculiar quality only small towns seem to hold, a mixture of baked asphalt, faintly sweet from the candy shop 2 streets over, and the earthy scent of fallen leaves curling in the gutters. It was early October, the kind of day when the sun still had warmth, but shadows hinted at the coming chill. Main Street stretched out in front of him, not much more than 3 blocks of brick-faced shops, faded awnings, and a single traffic light that blinked lazily from green to yellow. A church bell chimed somewhere in the distance, its sound folding into the everyday hum of the town. Tires over pavement, a radio playing faintly from an open cafe door, the metallic clink of tools from the auto shop. He moved slowly, his right leg dragging in a subtle rhythm, the soft rubber tips of his crutches making a dull thud-thud against the sidewalk. They were old crutches, wooden, polished from years of use, the edges worn smooth from the curve of his palms. His khaki jacket was zipped halfway, not quite military issue anymore, but the cut of it was unmistakable to anyone who knew. Underneath, the fabric of his shirt pulled slightly at the shoulder where the seam had been repaired by hand. If you looked closely, you might see the faint outline of something heavy in the inner pocket of that jacket, something that shifted with each step. Most people didn't notice. Most didn't look long enough. But the group of young men leaning against the red brick wall of Rosie's diner did. There were 4 of them, all in their late teens or early 20s. One had a baseball cap tilted back on his head. Another chewed on a toothpick, spitting it onto the pavement when he saw the man approach. They didn't move aside. Instead, they exchanged grins that carried the sharp edge of boredom, looking for amusement. "Betty's just milking it," one murmured, his voice just loud enough to carry. The others chuckled. "Slow as a snail," another added, mockingly dragging his foot in imitation. The man kept his gaze forward. He had heard worse. A younger version of himself might have turned, might have said something sharp, might have let his temper do the talking. But he wasn't that man anymore. At least, he told himself he wasn't. Now, he measured his breaths, kept his stride steady, didn't let the hook of their words catch. Still, the sting was there. Not in his leg, that pain was constant, familiar, but somewhere deeper. His name was Daniel Cole, though in the Army they had called him Coleman. That was a lifetime ago. Born in Redford, he'd left at 19 with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a head full of the kind of restless ambition only small towns seem to breed. He'd served in the Special Forces, a world far removed from this quiet street. The missions had been varied, some covert, some loud enough to make the news, but all of them had carried the same weight: get in, get it done, get your people home. The Limp was the result of the last mission, though he never spoke about it in detail. The paperwork called it an extraction under hostile engagement. The reality was a night of chaos, smoke, and the metallic taste of blood in the back of his throat. A single bullet had shattered the bone in his leg. The medic said he was lucky. Lucky to walk. Lucky to be alive. He'd smiled at that, though it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. After discharge, he'd come back to Redford, rented a small apartment above the hardware store, worked part-time at the VFW hall, organizing events, helping younger vets navigate the labyrinth of paperwork that came with benefits and claims. And he'd gotten used to moving slowly. The reason he was out on Main Street today was simple. The town was holding its annual harvest parade. The streets had been closed off to cars since morning, lined with folding chairs and the occasional picnic blanket where families waited for the floats to pass. Children with painted faces darted between clusters of adults. A marching band was warming up 2 streets away, the brassy sound drifting lazily over the rooftops. Daniel had no intention of watching the parade itself. Too much noise, too much spectacle. But the parade meant that some of the older vets would be gathered at the Memorial Plaza near the end of Main Street, and he had promised to bring a stack of programs from the print shop. It should have been a simple walk. As he approached the corner where the diner stood, The voices of the young men grew clearer. "Look at him," the one with the cap said, not bothering to lower his voice this time. "Probably tells everyone he's some kind of war hero." Another laughed. "More like War Zero." The others joined in, a quick burst of laughter that was too loud for the quiet street. A few passers-by glanced over but didn't say anything. In towns like this, people knew better than to get involved in someone else's business. Daniel kept moving, but the weight in his chest grew heavier with each step. The crosswalk ahead was wide, the white paint faded from years of traffic. Halfway across, a gust of wind caught the hem of his jacket, pushing it aside just enough to reveal the patch sewn onto his shirt, a silver dagger set against a dark green shield. Most wouldn't recognize it, but those who had served, especially in certain units, would. It wasn't the kind of patch you could just buy at a surplus store. You earned it and you kept it. He saw the smirks falter for just a heartbeat, not gone, just hesitant. That was when he heard it. At first, it was just a low hum, easy to mistake for distant traffic. But it grew quickly, deepening into a sound that seemed to press into the very air, the unmistakable growl of diesel engines, heavy ones. The sound deepened, each beat of the engine like a hammer in the chest. Heads began to turn, conversations trailed off, and the small-town quiet fractured into a new kind of silence, the kind that holds its breath. Daniel reached the far side of the crosswalk and stopped, his crutches rooted to the cracked pavement. The young men by the diner shifted, their easy arrogance beginning to erode. Then the convoy appeared. 2 armored vehicles rolled slowly into view, their matte green hulls coated in a fine layer of dust. Sunlight flashed off reinforced glass. Behind them, a flatbed truck carried something covered in a heavy tarp, the edges snapping in the wind. But it was the men walking alongside the lead vehicle that drew the most attention. 4 soldiers in full combat gear, their strides perfectly in sync, helmets, visors, rifles slung across their chests. At the front, just a step ahead of the others, was a figure in a black beret. As the convoy slowed to a near stop in front of the diner, the man in the beret glanced toward the sidewalk. His gaze swept past the young men, past the diner's flickering neon sign, and then locked onto Daniel. For a moment, time compressed. The man's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something sharper, recognition. Without hesitation, he raised his hand in a crisp salute. It wasn't casual, it wasn't for show. It was the kind of salute that carried weight, history, and respect. Every soldier in sight mirrored it. The change in the air was instant. Passers-by froze, eyes darting between Daniel and the convoy. A mother tugged her son closer, whispering something he couldn't hear. The young man with the baseball cap stood rigid, color draining from his face. Daniel returned the salute, slow and deliberate. His arm didn't move as fast as it once had, but the precision was still there. He held it for 3 heartbeats, then let it drop. The man in the beret stepped off the curb, his boots hitting the pavement with the solid sound of someone who had walked into danger before and would do it again. He approached Daniel directly. "Sir," he said, voice low but carrying. "It's an honor." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Didn't expect to see your unit this far north." "Passing through," the man replied, "but when I saw you, I had to stop." He reached out and they clasped hands. The grip was firm, almost defiant against the weight of years gone by. From the corner of his eye, Daniel saw the young men watching. One of them looked away. Another pretended to check his phone. The man in the beret turned toward them, scanning their faces. "You boys treat this man right," he said, not loud, but with the kind of authority that made it impossible not to hear. "He's earned more than you can imagine." The soldiers reformed behind their leader, the convoy engines rumbling patiently. The man in the beret gave Daniel one last nod before stepping back toward the street. As the vehicles began to move again, the sound rolled through the narrow blocks, fading into the distance until it was just the faint hum of a town returning to itself. Daniel adjusted his grip on his crutches and started forward. The street felt different now, wider, lighter somehow. The whispers had stopped. The young men didn't say another word. By the time Daniel reached the Memorial Plaza, the first floats of the parade were making their way down Main Street. Children waved from decorated trailers. Confetti drifted lazily to the ground. He handed the stack of programs to a fellow vet, nodded politely at the thanks, and found a seat on a low stone wall. Somewhere behind him, laughter returned to the street. But it was a different kind, lighter, without the sharpness it had held before. Daniel didn't need to look back to know that the lesson had been learned, not because of what he had said — he'd said almost nothing — but because of who had stood behind him when it mattered. Daniel sits quietly at the edge of the memorial, parade music faint in the background. The camera slowly pulls back, revealing the line of the street where the convoy had passed, sunlight glinting off the pavement. Fade to black.